The successful germination of seeds is one of the key requirements for growing a good crop of vegetables in a garden. But it's not always a simple task to ensure that good germination will actually happen, or to determine the reasons why seeds didn't germinate as expected. Sometimes when seeds don't germinate, it's possible to simply re-sow with a new batch of seeds, or to fill in any gaps in germination with another crop. But sometimes poor germination can lead to a loss of a crop, or to have less than is expected, especially with the time-sensitive, fast-growing crops that I try to squeeze into the gardens before the space is needed for the main crop of the season. And with experience, I've become more successful at ensuring decent germination of a wide range of different vegetable seeds in different conditions, though I still struggle at times, and that can be frustrating. And I had an interesting example of inconsistent germination of a range of different vegetables in my larger polytunnel this spring, and it took me a while to figure out what was actually going on. The beds in this protected growing space had been empty over the winter, and I had planned to sow a range of fast-growing spring crops in February and March. I sowed 10 different crops at the same time in a single long bed, with a few weeks between sowing each of the 4 beds in the polytunnel in order to have a staggered succession of these crops later in the spring. While a few of the crops were transplanted into the bed, most of the vegetable seeds were sown directly into the layer of compost that we had covered the surface of the beds with as part of the strategy of reducing the cultivation or avoiding digging the soil in this garden. Because of the cold temperatures that we had earlier in the spring, the germination of the first few beds was delayed, but after a few weeks it became obvious that there was inconsistent germination in patches along the rows of seedlings within all of the beds. I knew this wasn't an issue with poor seed quality, as all of the different types of vegetables were affected, and the same seed had produced good germination in the other gardens. I also ruled out the possibility of slugs or some other pest eating the seedlings as they germinated, as this polytunnel is largely free of slugs, and there wasn't the telltale sign of the stub of the seedling left behind. I wasn't sure if the colder weather over a few-week period would have been much of an issue, as even some of the later sowings had the same issue of poor germination, when it was actually quite a bit warmer. And I had really good germination last year in this polytunnel with similar crops using the same bed preparation method. So I think the different watering method that I used this year was probably the most likely cause of this inconsistent germination. Last year, I watered the direct sown crops by hand using 2 watering cans filled from a large water tank to evenly water the surface of all the beds. But this year I relied more on an overhead sprinkler system that I had recently installed in order to reduce the amount of effort and time needed to keep the soil sufficiently moist for the seeds and the young plants. There has been a temporary issue with this sprinkler system because of the low water pressure that we currently have to deal with, and until this is fixed with a new section of pipe, the pressure is quite low and can actually vary quite a bit depending on if other people are using the supply. I figured that this would probably be okay because I was able to adjust the system so that all of the polytunnel was watered even with the low pressure, and I was topping up with occasional hand watering of all the beds as well. But this wasn't enough, as it became apparent that parts of the beds were drying out faster than others, with a patchy pattern of wet and dry areas becoming visible within a few hours after watering with the sprinklers. And these drier areas coincided with the areas of poor or no germination of the seeds. This was disappointing because I thought it would have been okay with the 2 different methods of watering that I had used, and it wasn't immediately obvious to me why this had failed. I think one of the key issues was the quality of the compost that I had recently added as a thick layer onto the surface of the beds. This compost was part of a large load of bulk compost that we had purchased, made mostly out of shredded wood and other landscape waste. I had used the compost from this supplier before, but this batch seemed a bit fresher and not quite so decomposed, or at least had not had a chance to mature as much. If I'd put this compost on the garden beds last autumn, there would have been a chance for it to settle in and continue to decompose on the surface of the soil. But I didn't allow the time for this to happen, as the seeds were sown into the bed shortly after the compost was added. And because we had added such a thick layer of compost, most of the seeds were positioned in the layer of compost itself instead of in the soil underneath. And any seeds in those dry sections either didn't get enough water to germinate, with some of them germinating later when conditions improved, or they germinated and then dried up and died before they had a chance to appear above the surface. I imagine the relatively loose and dark compost on the surface dried out very quickly with the heat of the sun on a few of the warm sunny days that we did have. And because the compost wasn't firmly pressed into the soil or hadn't settled into place, there wasn't a close connection between the particles or small pieces of the compost to enable the water to move through the compost with capillary action to bring more moisture up from deeper in the soil, similar to how a sponge or a cloth can become fully wet even if only part of it is immersed in water. I imagine this was made worse by the fact that the individual particles of compost would have shrunk as they dried, creating an even looser granule material that was less likely to maintain that essential capillary action. So, the low and variable pressure of the water caused inconsistent coverage with the sprinklers, which meant that some of the areas of compost ended up drying out faster than the others. But I still wondered why the hand watering that I had done to prevent this from happening wasn't enough. When I scraped back some of the compost in different sections of the bed to try to figure out what was going on, I noticed that even after watering with the watering cans, there was a layer of really dry compost underneath, a thin, wet layer on the surface. It seems that the dry patches were hydrophobic, actually repelling the water or preventing the water from flowing down into the compost. And even though I watered these areas, the moisture wasn't consistently getting down into these sections of these compost. It seems that the way that I was hand watering was actually part of the problem. I had been filling the watering cans and drenching the soil with a fair amount of water in a fairly short period of time. And in the sections of the bed that had really dry compost underneath, this water was pooling on the surface rather than filtering down and most likely moving horizontally to some place where a crack or a section of moist compost enabled it to drain away deeper into the soil below. So even though I was adding a fair amount of water, most of it was flowing away from or around these dry patches every time I watered. And the thin layer of moist compost on the surface dried out very quickly, adding to the problem. I realized that instead of drenching small sections of the bed at one time, I needed to shift to a process of watering lightly and repeating multiple times, even if the same amount of water was added in the end. So instead of a sudden downpour that would flow away without wetting part of the compost, I needed to water lightly in layers that would allow the water to seep down slowly so that there was a better chance that these dry patches underneath would get re-moistened. Essentially, I needed to do a lot more walking back and forth up and down the rows between the beds when I was watering by hand. But instead, I had been trying to save time and to be efficient with the tasks so that I could get on with work in the other gardens. If I had done this from the beginning, there might not have been such an issue, but because I had let areas dry out quite significantly, it took quite a bit of time and regular light watering in order to re-moisten all of the compost. So, the simple reason for this inconsistent germination is that I didn't water enough, or I watered in an inappropriate way for the context. But, as usual, it's a little bit more complex than that, because if any of a number of other factors had been different, this issue may not have occurred. If the compost had been more mature, or if it had been added to the surface of the soil last autumn and kept moist over the winter, and had a chance to settle in, then I think the risk of dry patches forming would have been reduced. And I wonder if it would have been better if the compost had been pressed or firmed in after sowing the seeds, to establish better capillary flow rather than being so loose. Of course, if I had fixed the water pressure earlier in the season, then the sprinklers would have been much more effective at distributing the water more evenly across the entire area of the garden. This would have significantly reduced the potential dry areas and the work that I needed to do to top it up with hand watering. And having those sunny days at a crucial time in the germination of the seeds definitely didn't help, but I should have been much more attentive to how quickly the compost was drying out in the sun. If I had watered differently by hand, with lighter layers, rather than dumping a lot of water at one time, this would have helped. And from now on, I will definitely be watching out for water pooling on the surface rather than flowing down, as this is an obvious sign that the compost or soil underneath may have become hydrophobic and may need some extra attention to re-moisten. In the end, I did get a decent harvest of early spring and hungry gap crops from this polytunnel, though the yield and the consistency wasn't as good as it could have been if one or more of these factors had been slightly different. But that seems to be the case with so much of what happens in the gardens, and an experience like this is part of the learning process that it seems that I and most other growers have to go through in order to be able to consistently produce lots of high-quality vegetables year after year, especially if we keep changing how we do things.